Hi, my name is Nolan Stolz, and I'm a Black Sabbath scholar and author of the book Experiencing Black Sabbath, A Listener's Companion. And today I wanted to share with you one of my favorite Tony Iommi riffs. It's among his very heaviest and darkest of the early 1970s, and I'm sharing this with you today because some of you may have not heard it before because it doesn't appear on any studio album. I refer to it as the mid-March 72 riff because it can be heard on audience recordings from March 10th, 15th, 16th, and 17th. This means that this riff would have been a contender for the Volume 4 album, which came out later that year. One of the big misconceptions about this album is that it was written and recorded only in Los Angeles, but in fact, they started writing the material back in 1971, and then in January 72, they went to Marquee Studios in London and recorded some backing tracks there. In fact, they told Sounds magazine that the album would come out in sometime as early as March, and they told New Musical Express that the album would be out in April. They didn't go to LA until after all of that. So this riff coming from March certainly would have been around this time when they were still developing material for the album. Now I'd like to share why this riff sounds particularly heavy and dark. There's really three main reasons. Now, I'll demonstrate on the guitar, but I should warn the guitarist that I'm not really a guitarist. In fact, guitar is like my fourth instrument behind drums and keys and bass. So I'm just here to demonstrate. So excuse my technique. But the first reason would be that the lowest string is slightly muted, so palm muted through distortion, and it gives a little crunchy sound. Okay. The second reason is that this is not an E. The string, the note that's usually for the lowest string. At this time, they're tuning down to C sharp, so they're down a minor third. So with this lower note, rather than being up here, it's down there, it makes it a little bit heavier. And the third reason is really what gives it its dark character, and that is this flat 2 chord. So we're in C sharp minor, and there's a D chord. So the riff, it goes down from E down to D sharp, and then there's this little Phrygian inflection of the D natural, and then resolving back down to tonic. Now you may recognize those chords from War Pigs because they're essentially the same thing. It's the same thing. It goes down chromatically, hits that flat 2 chord, giving that real dark character. Now, the Paranoid album is at standard pitch, so it's a little bit higher, but that's really irrelevant. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate this riff for you. It begins with those C sharps, and then it does there's that flat 2. Yeah, here we go. Now, when they play this riff, it's presented in a little ABA structure. So there's a contrasting riff immediately following. And that riff helps to make this heavy riff that we've been talking about sound even heavier. And I'll explain why. So the contrasting riff moves harmonically to the subdominant, 4, this key, F sharp. So then after it goes into the E, back to F sharp, and then there's A, B, and it's played twice, and then that second time that A, B leads back to the C sharp. But what's really happening here that really makes it sound heavy is that all of these chords are sustaining. And then when it returns to that heavy riff and you get the palm muted thing again, it makes it sound even heavier. Now that riff might sound familiar to you because Metallica does an almost identical riff on Seek and Destroy on their Kill 'Em All album from 1983. Now, they're in standard tuning, E, so they're a little bit higher, but again, that's not really relevant. It's essentially the same four chords descending, and I'll demonstrate that real quickly. So if you know the chorus from Seek and Destroy, those four chords. Now later in that song, at about 5 minutes and 50 seconds, they do a cool little variation on that chorus riff and turn it into this. Now, it's very similar to the Sabbath riff, but the primary difference is the rhythmic profile. Notice in the Metallica, each one leads down to the next that goes to the downbeat. Ba-dum, ba-dum, 2, 3, 4. Okay? But in the Sabbaths, not surprisingly, it's based on a syncopated rhythm. So rather than leading to the downbeat, it actually syncopates after the beat. So in the Sabbath, it goes like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. 2, 3, 4. Bow, bow, bow. 2, 3, 4. Ba, ba, ba. Syncopated, as opposed to very on the beat, like the Metallica example. And so the tempo is a little bit different, and like I mentioned before, the key is a little bit different because they're not detuned, but that's not really relevant. They're essentially the same riff, but have a different rhythmic profile. So before we listen to Tony play this, I wanted to say a couple things about the riff that is in the middle, that contrasting riff. Now it too does not end up in a Sabbath song on a studio album, but there are elements of it that end up in a riff from Wheels of Confusion and a couple riffs from St. Vitus Dance, and these are presented around other riffs that are similar to those of Cornucopia. So you really can see how they're developing this material before it ends up on the album. Now those are things that I'll cover in my next book, Sabbath as a Live Band. The Experiencing Black Sabbath book is really focused on the studio albums. I talk a little bit about the live, but that's not the focus. So what I'll do in the next book is look at the material that they're presenting live and how that turned into what became on the album, and also what on the album, how it was presented live, what are the differences, and how those songs developed over time. So look for that when that comes out. So let's have a listen to Tony playing this riff. I think you'll like it. Like I said, it's one of my favorite riffs. It's heavy, it's dark, and from 1972, it's right along the other stuff from Volume 4. Great work.